From its humble prairie beginnings in 1870 to a bustling railroad town, a coal mining center, and more, Appleton City has overcome many challenges and adapted to every change over the past 150 years. The strong feeling of community and small town pride felt by the folks that call this place home continue to help this town thrive and will help it meet the challenges to come in the next 150 years. The town was originally founded as Arlington, Missouri. That all changed when a publisher from New York agreed to build a library for the town and donated books to fill it. In exchange for the library, he asked that they name the town after him. His name was W.H. Appleton. And so in 1870, Appleton City was born. The railroad arrived in 1870 when the Tebow and Neosho Railroad reached the town. It later became the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, the MKT. It brought business, settlers, and prosperity to Appleton City. In the early 1900s, healing waters were found under Appleton. A 1,300-foot well hit water that didn't flow very fast, but was high in mineral content. People came from all around for its curative powers. Coal mining changed the landscape in the 1950s. It brought more people to town and boosted the economy for over a decade. Traces of its environmental impact can still be seen in the strip pits that encompass the city to the north, east, and south. Today, Appleton City still basks in its historic past. In 2019, after much hard work by several members of the community, Appleton City's main street was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Before settlers began moving into the area, it was occupied by many Native American groups. From Mississippian mound builders to the Osage Indians in the 1700s, this prairie, sitting on the edge between the Ozark foothills and the Great Plains, was an attractive hunting ground. The fertile soils easily supported crops and grew vast acres of prairie that supported buffalo and other wildlife. Spanish and French fur traders and trappers moved through the area, interacting with the native peoples and establishing relationships and outposts to trade goods and furs. Some 17 miles to the southwest of Appleton City, a large Osage village was established in the early 1700s. That village was home to nearly 3,000 people who undoubtedly hunted and explored the prairie where Appleton City now stands. Evidence of these visitors have been and still can be found in the farmland surrounding the town. Arrowheads are routinely found along the creeks and streams in the area and in the plowed fields in springtime. The Osage Indians, who called themselves Washashi, or people of the Middle Waters, were hunters, gatherers, and farmers. Bands of hunters roamed the countryside, hunting buffalo, deer, and elk, while the women tended the crops of corn, beans, and squash, and gathered nuts and berries in the area. Evidence of this work can be seen in the rocks around the village site, where marks are present, created from the cracking of nuts and the grinding of corn. Evidence of Appleton City's connection to these early residents can be seen in these baskets. They were given as payment to E.O. Deerfield in the early 1900s by a group of Native Americans that were passing through Appleton City. He owned the local saddlery shop and had repaired some harnesses for them. In 1795, Fort Carondelet was built along the Osage River by Augusta Choteau to engage in trade with the Osage and ensure peace between the native tribes and early settlers. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1804, where the United States acquired much of the land west of the Mississippi River from France, the Osage Indians were forced out of the area through increasing settlement by Americans and treaties signed with the United States government. Even as settlers began to move into the western reaches of the Missouri Territory, not many settled in and around the area which would later become Appleton City. These pioneers preferred to live near streams and woodlands, like those areas closer to the Osage River. The constant fear of wildfires and lack of water discouraged homesteading on the prairie. Few settlers moved into the region during the mid-1800s. Clinton and Osceola were established trading posts, and there wasn't a need for settlement in the area. On December 12, 1859, Samuel Clough received 2 land patents from the U.S. government that included the future site of Appleton City. During the Civil War, marauding bands of bushwhackers and jayhawkers ravaged the area. Jim Lane and his jayhawkers from Kansas raided Missouri in September of 1861. Mary Lane, a Rockville resident in 1939, recalled watching Jim Lane's army crossing the Osage River at the Beale Ford and march through Taborville and out into the prairie. She remembered after some 78 years how the hot September sun shining on their bayonets looked like a long stream of fire. Lane, with a contingent of 2,000 jayhawkers, burned Osceola to the ground on September 23, 1861. In August 1863, infamous Order No. 11 was given to remove all rural families living in Jackson, Cass, Bates, and northern Vernon counties from their homes, regardless of their loyalty to the Union. While the area of future Appleton City was already sparsely populated, the tensions caused by these warring groups during the Civil War hindered settlement in the region. In 1867, William Pryor, seen in these 2 images, and Christopher Shue purchased 520 acres from Sam Clough for a price of $2.50 an acre, including the land on which Appleton City now sits. The following year, William Pryor bought out Mr. Shue. When he purchased the land in 1868, there were only 4 houses in sight across the surrounding countryside. In September of 1870, Pryor sold some of the land to the Appleton City Townsite Company for $9 an acre, according to the AC Journal in 1924. In selling the land, he had 2 stipulations. 1, that the company give 1 block for what now stands as Forest Park, and 2, that the main street through town be 100 feet from storefront to storefront. His amazing foresight created the beautiful downtown area of Appleton City that is still enjoyed by its citizens today. When the land was purchased, as reported in an April 1871 newspaper article, it was occupied for the most part by a cornfield, the yellow grain then ready for the garnering hand of the husbandman, with beautiful prairie sweeping away on either side. By October 1871, the town was surveyed and platted, with the first house beginning construction on October 15th. On the 23rd of November, the paper wrote, a public auction sale of lots was made by the town company, bringing to the embryo city a large number of capitalists and others seeking investments in homes. Comparatively few lots, however, were sold to speculators. Most of those purchasing were settling down and improving, having sufficient confidence in the place and its prospects to make it their permanent home. Their confidence in the success of this town was boosted by the arrival of the railroad. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad connecting Sedalia and Fort Scott arrived in Appleton City on or about September 10, 1870. This made the town the center of travel, shipping, and production in the area. The town was originally named Charlemont in November of 1870 and was soon changed to Arlington. However, there was already another town in Missouri named Arlington, and the decision was made to choose another name. This turned out to be more difficult than expected. During this process, J.R. Barrett, the secretary of the town, had taken a trip on the train and met a man by the name of W.H. Appleton. Barrett mentioned to him the trouble the town was having in selecting a name. Mr. Appleton, a wealthy publisher from New York City, offered to build a school or public library in the town if they would name it after him. They took him up on his offer, agreeing to name the town Appleton, and chose to have him donate a public library. Mr. Appleton donated $300 to build the library and 500 books to stock it. The library was originally built in the center of Forest Park and later moved to the west side. The Park Library, as it was called in an 1899 Appleton City Journal article, was open on Saturday afternoons for citizens to check out books. By 1900, the library had fallen into disuse as no provisions were made to add new books. Now it was only open by request. In 1923, the building was sold and the books were put into storage. In May of 1924, the City Library Association was formed to collect books and raise money to reopen the library. Today, the Appleton City Public Library can be found on 4th Street, while the original library building has been restored and sits in the historic district across from the depot. Back to that name Appleton. Turns out, there was already a town in Missouri named Appleton. It was a few miles north of Cape Girardeau. The leaders of our Appleton chose to add the word city to separate it from the other Appleton. On December 28, 1871, the name Appleton City became official. Appleton City became so successful that in 1918, the other Appleton changed its name to Old Appleton so it would no longer be confused with Appleton City. The arrival of the railroad in 1870 gave Appleton City an advantage over its older neighbor, Hudson City, located 4 miles to the west. Hudson had been established in 1867 and thrived until the railroad bypassed it and landed in Appleton. In 1871, 25 houses, 3 business buildings, and 1 church were moved by auction from Hudson to Appleton City. This new town continued to grow as more businesses and families moved in. As reported in an April 1871 newspaper article, there are at present over 200 buildings completed and many more in the process of erection. The population is little, if any, short of 1,000. That same article reported 2 hotels, 3 dry goods houses, 2 hardware and 3 grocery houses, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 lumber yards, 1 livery stable, 1 furniture store, 1 jewelry store, 3 drug stores, 2 saddlery and harness shops, 1 barber shop, 2 shoemakers, and 1 milliner, maker of women's hats. By the late 1880s, nearly 2,000 people called Appleton City home. One of the factors that helped Appleton City grow so rapidly was the railroad. It was a lifeline for early towns. The arrival of the railroad in Appleton City, on or about September 10, 1870, brought businesses and families into the area. Men working on the railroad, stockyards to ship livestock to markets, goods to supply all sorts of businesses arrived on the railroad. Travelers came from all over the country to experience the healing powers of the Sulfo-Lithia well. The railroad brought U.S. presidents to Appleton City. Rutherford B. Hayes and William H. Taft both traveled through Appleton City on the train. President Rutherford B. Hayes passed through Appleton City twice, once before he was elected president during his election campaign. Then he came through on the train again in September of 1879, headed to Fort Scott, Kansas on his presidential Midwestern tour. In November 1917, former President William Howard Taft, after giving a speech in Butler, spent the night in the Durley Hotel across from the depot so he could catch the 5 a.m. Katy Flyer train. The most horrible accident that has ever occurred in the history of our city. This is a headline from the Appleton City Journal on May 6, 1897. It reads, on May 5, 1897, Mrs. Sylvester House and Mrs. Thomas Payne had been out calling that afternoon and had just left the Durley Hotel, hurrying home as it was then after supper time. Nearing the railroad crossing, they observed a freight train of considerable length approaching, and fearing it would stop in front of the depot and obstruct the crossing for some length of time, as is a daily occurrence, the ladies concluded to hasten their steps and try to make it across. Mr. Ben Baskerville, realizing the danger, halted and turned around and threw up his arms in front of the ladies with the hope of preventing them from attempting to cross. Mrs. Payne halted, but Mrs. House pushed her way to the right and passed Mr. Baskerville, who stood only a few feet from the track. She then seemed to realize that she could not get across and hesitated for a second, as if she intended to turn back, when she was struck by the engine and fell upon the cowcatcher, on which she was carried a distance of about 60 feet and thrown to the left side of the track. Mr. Baskerville and A.M. Pegg, who was standing in his stable door, were the first to reach the body and say that life was extinct when they got to it. Several of those who witnessed the accident have been seen by the Journal and corroborate the facts as above stated. The railroad continued to be a source of life for the town well into the 1950s. Passenger trains stopped at Appleton City from the earliest days, including troop trains during World War II. Passenger service came to an end in 1958. Freight trains continued to use the tracks into the 1980s. Trains still move through town today, sometimes halting traffic on Main Street for half an hour or more. The depot was the center of this railroad activity. Built in 1870 at a cost of $2,900, the depot, which originally sat on the west side of the tracks, welcomed thousands of travelers to Appleton City and watched just as many leave town. The AC Journal wrote in June of 1905, the Improvement Association did a good thing when they caused this unsightly plot of ground to be converted into a park that is the source of much pride to our citizens. Once passenger service ended in 1958, the depot wasn't needed and fell into disrepair. In 1987, the railroad agreed to let the city have the depot, and it was moved to its current location on the other side of the tracks. The depot was badly in need of attention. Many hours were given to restoring the old depot to its former glory. Restoration of the depot was completed in 1995. Today, Railroad Park is the beautiful centerpiece of the town. On August 1, 1900, the city drilled a prospect well 2 blocks north of Main Street by the railroad. According to the AC Journal, at 1,294 feet they decided to test the water. A large crowd had gathered, and a shout of joy went up when a great stream of water, accompanied by a regular Monegaw Springs odor, gushed from the pipe. The fluid is clear and cool and declared by many to be superior to the famous Monegaw Springs water. Local citizen Walter Farnham christened it the Fountain of Youth. The Journal went on to state that Phil Klein, W.B. Stout, Phil Warner, T.J. Gibson, Captain Donahue, W.A. Walker, Penn Morris, and several other invalids of long standing have volunteered to give the curative properties of the water a thorough test, and by next week we hope to have an array of testimonials that will cause a grand rush of the afflicted from all parts of the globe to Appleton City. The AC Journal on August 6, 1900, reported that Professor Paul Schweitzer, chemist of the State Agricultural College at Columbia, tested the water and found 750 grains of mineral to the gallon, much stronger in medicinal properties than water so far discovered in the deep wells of the state. A ditch was dug and pipe laid by Captain Donahue to transport the water to a drinking fountain by the depot. The AC Journal on June 27, 1901 reported, when the passenger train comes in, it is both amusing and gratifying to see the thirsty passengers hurriedly scrambling out of the cars to get a drink of the sparkling water. The ladies often make faces and declare that it is horrid, but the next time they come back, they want another drink just the same. Everybody learns to like sulfolithia, and they just can't help it, said a lady yesterday. By 1886, Appleton City had some 2,000 residents and was a bustling railroad town. Appleton City had become the most important city in the area and had earned the nickname the Prairie Queen. Most of the wooden one-story buildings on the main street had now been replaced by brick buildings. In 1899, Klein Brothers Mercantile became the second business establishment to install acetylene gas lighting, which, according to the AC Journal, added greatly to the appearance and convenience of the large and well-arranged mercantile establishment. W.B. Stout had been the first businessman to install acetylene gas lighting in a business. Prior to that, light was provided by oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. Gas lights were a big improvement. In November 1899, 3 businessmen from Montgomery City, Missouri, visited Appleton City and offered to build an electricity plant to service the town. They asked the city to install 16 street lights at $7 per month, and each business or house that installed 3 or more lights would pay 50 cents a month. In the March 1900 special election, the citizens of Appleton turned down the electricity plant with 116 votes for and 82 votes against. Passage required a 2/3 majority. By April 1905, the citizens had changed their minds and approved a measure to build an electricity plant by a 248-2 vote. Notice the electric lines running down both sides of the street. In the beginning, the electricity was only on from 5 a.m. until 7 or 8 a.m. so morning household chores could be completed. Then it was turned on again in the late afternoon until midnight for evening meals and nighttime activities. William Pryor had stipulated that the block where the park now sits be designated as a city park. From this early picture, we can get an idea of the possible reason it was named Forest Park. In 1934, a severe drought set in and many of the trees died. The AC Journal of January 24, 1935 reports that the one thing that has evoked more complimentary remarks from visitors and civic pride is our city park. The loss of mature trees in the past few months by the drought was traceable to the fact that no one felt the personal responsibility of watering and caring for them. A permanent committee, which was a predecessor to our current park board, was created to look after the park. By the 1950s, most of the trees were gone. Today, Forest Park continues as a reminder of the amazing foresight of Appleton City's founding fathers. In 1914, the Rock Pavilion was added for gatherings and concerts. Here we see it at the dedication ceremony. Notice the open roof. By the 1920s, it was covered in vines. In later years, a roof was added to protect it from the weather. Today, the pavilion is still an important focal point of the park. Other structures were added in the 1950s and 1980s. From that same 1935 AC Journal article comes this bit of advice. This park was given us by our fathers, and it is our duty and your duty to preserve it. Appleton City community must not fail. In years to come, those who admire its beauty and enjoy its comfort will breathe a word of thanks. The well, located in the middle of 4th Street, had the fire tower and bell above it. When a fire was discovered, the bell was rung and people would come running to set up the bucket brigade to fight the fire. A replica of part of the tower and the actual bell can now be found in Forest Park. Lots of businesses have served the Appleton City community over the past 150 years. Durley Hall was built in 1881 by H.S. Gransley. It stood 45 feet high and was 110 feet deep and was built at a cost of $20,000. Over the years, it hosted plays and operas and was the pride of the community. In later life, several businesses occupied the building. By 2020, it had deteriorated to the point that it had to be torn down. Built in 1892 as the Durley Hotel and situated across from the depot, this building served the needs of the many travelers and salesmen who came to Appleton City. President Taft even slept here once. The large dining room was a popular place for all to eat and the site of many social events. In the mid-1930s, Dr. Ellett purchased the hotel and it became the town's hospital until 1974. In 1994, Mr. and Mrs. Leroy Swope bought the building and carefully restored and remodeled it. The Luxinger Building was built in 1902 by Adam Luxinger and was the first three-story building in Appleton City. It housed his hardware business, the Luxinger Mercantile Company. Lampkin Hardware occupied the building from 1924 to 1963. After that, two different manufacturing businesses were there. The building, which stood next to the Appleton City Library, was torn down in 2018. Many other businesses have served the citizens of Appleton over the years. City Hall started life as retail businesses. The old City Hall building was a boot and shoe store, and the current City Hall was a grocery and Queensware dishes store at one point. Zink Automotive was founded in 1916 and is one of the oldest Ford dealerships in the United States. There have been mechanics and garages and businesses to supply the parts they need. There have been establishments to purchase dry goods and merchandise, and many grocery stores over the years. There were hardware stores and lumber yards, banks to look after the financial aspects of the community, drugstores, even harness and saddle shops, which died slowly after the invention of automobiles and tractors, millineries, which were makers of women's hats. The newspaper has always been important in Appleton City. The AC Journal has been around since 1881 and is still in publication today. There have been medical professionals and a hospital. At one time, in the early 1900s, there were 7 doctors and 2 dentists in town. Today, West Central Missouri Community Action Agency occupies several buildings on Main Street. There have been feed and seed stores, gas stations, several restaurants, and churches to support the faith of the community. You name it, you could find it in Appleton City. Over the years, others have come and gone. A watch and jewelry shop, a musical instrument store, shoemakers, livery stables, booksellers, meat markets, a bowling alley, a movie theater, and many, many more. The families that settled in the area of Appleton City valued education. This is evident because a school was already in place before the town was incorporated in December of 1870. That small one-room school stood where Donahue Dugan Park now sits. Understanding the importance of education, the citizens began to think on a grander scale. A 4-room brick building was constructed in 1871. It was located in the 300 block of West 5th Street. In 1882, a room was added to accommodate all the new students as Appleton City grew rapidly in the early 1880s. This building was used until 1915. It burned to the ground on January 17, 1915. A grade school was built in 1885 to allow for better education of the younger students. It sat in the 400 block of South Chestnut. This brick building was used for grades 1 through 8. This building was torn down in 1935, with the bricks being used in the construction of a building at the present school complex. The Dunbar School was located in the north part of Appleton City at the corner of 7th and Beach. It was a 1-room, 1st through 8th grade school for African American children during the days of segregation in Missouri. This 1911 photo shows teacher Miss Bessie Brooks with her students. In September 1888, the Appleton City Academy, a private school dedicated to preparing students for university studies, was opened in the 500 block of East 3rd Street. A wood frame building was erected with several other buildings being added for other uses. Attendance was good, with 47 students attending the first year, so the building was enlarged at the end of the year. In 1908 and 09, a large brick 2-story building was added. The founder of the AC Academy was G.A. Thielman. Many students from the town and local countryside attended, with the rural students boarding in homes of townspeople during the week. The academy closed in 1913 or 14, and the building was purchased by Appleton City Public Schools in 1927. A bond was passed to make it suitable for grade school students, and it was used for this purpose until 1958. Also pictured is Appleton City's first school bus, driven by George Ellis in the 1940s. In September 1915, the cornerstone was laid for a new high school to replace the one that burned in January. Placed on the lot of the previous school, the building served as the high school until December 1931, when it too succumbed to a fire. With the loss of this school, a new location was sought for the schools. In June of 1932, the cornerstone for the third high school was laid. This school was built in the 400 block of West 4th Street and is still in use today as the grade school. On Saturday, June 11, 1932, the cornerstone for this building was laid by Harry S. Truman, who, in 13 short years, would become President of the United States. In July of 1951, Appleton City approved reorganization and added several rural schools to the system, becoming St. Clair County R2 schools. With the addition of the new students and deterioration of the old Academy grade school, plans were undertaken to build a new grade school next to the 1932 high school. The building was completed in 1958 and immediately went into use as the grade school. Today, this building sits between the 1932 school and the high school and houses grades 6 through 8. In 1974, a bond issue was passed to build a new high school and vocational agriculture building. Additional land was purchased and the building started. Students moved into the new building for the 1975-76 school year, with the class of 76 being the first to graduate in the new gym. Athletics have been important to the development of students since the early days of Appleton City schools. Here we see the 1898 AC Academy football team, the 1928 girls basketball team, check out those uniforms, and the AC men's baseball team in 1914, which was, as the AC Journal reports, very successful. This pride still exists today in AC athletics. The 2019 AC football team won the first conference championship in some 30 years. The girls basketball team played for a district championship for the first time in many years, and baseball, well, the coronavirus pandemic canceled most of the season. Community pride can also be seen in the athletic facilities in Appleton City. From the baseball field in 1951 to Bill Long Memorial Field and the other facilities at Donahue Dugan Park, to the new football field completed in 2019 and track complex which is still under construction, the citizens of Appleton City continue to work to improve our community. Coal was found early on in the Hudson area. Captain H.C. Donahue in 1883 started the coal mining operation to bring the coal to Appleton City. Coal was used for heat and fuel by the citizens of Appleton throughout the early 1900s. In 1949, the Pioneer Coal Company began mining coal in strip pits as much as 30 feet deep. Mining in these pits changed the landscape around Appleton City, which can still be seen today. The mines helped support Appleton's economy through the 1970s. One of the earliest manufacturing businesses was the Schlichtman Monuments Company in the 1880s. In the early 1900s, there was the Appleton City Broom Factory, which became one of the leading broom manufacturers in the region. In 1965, the Moray Toy Manufacturing Company from Kansas City moved into the Luxinger building. Local labor was used to produce a variety of stuffed toys. It was in business until 1971. Later, Cloverleaf Manufacturing, owned by Bruce and Florence Jackson, used the building to sew and fill orders for a variety of uniforms and aprons. There was a retail fabric shop on the ground floor that drew customers from other towns. Today, Noble Manufacturing, a metal fabrication and powder coating service, carries on the manufacturing tradition in Appleton City. With the onset of the Cold War in the 1960s, the United States government installed 150 ICBM launch sites in the area. These Minuteman missiles were on the front lines of the nuclear arms race. The threat of nuclear war surrounded Appleton City. The work on these sites brought families and jobs to the area. Crews worked to build the sites and control centers, with many families moving to Appleton City as a result. After completion of the missile sites, convoys of Air Force vehicles would race through town from time to time, carrying nuclear missiles and crews to the sites. Agriculture was a mainstay of Appleton City's economy from the very beginning. The first newspaper article about the town describes it as such. It was occupied for the most part by a cornfield, the yellow grain then ready for the garnering hand of the husbandman. Today, row crops of corn, soybeans, and wheat, and the businesses that support them continue to provide an economic boost for the area. Raising livestock has always been important here, from livery stables to equipment to stockyards and hatcheries. Today, thousands of head of cattle are raised each year, aided by area businesses that support livestock production. Main Street has changed a lot over the years, from dirt streets to pavement, wooden buildings to brick. Let's take a look at how it has changed over the past 150 years. In the 1900s, electricity arrived. In the 19-teens, automobiles started to come into use. The 1920s brought many improvements. Notice the dirt street in this photo. Main Street was paved in 1929. In the 1930s, the Depression took its toll. In the 1940s, World War II brought new advances in technology. In the 1950s, coal mining brought prosperity to town. In the 1960s, building miso silos increased the population and provided economic stability. The 1970s saw the Centennial Celebration. Today, Main Street is the vibrant focal point of the town. Early on, Appleton City became the place for fairs. As early as 1876, the St. Clair, Bates, and Henry County Fair was held in the southwest part of town. A 1,000-seat amphitheater and halls for art and agriculture were built. In 1952, the Golden Jubilee of the Appleton City Fair was held. The Appleton City Fair has been a big deal for a long time. Through the years, there have been livestock shows, talent shows, carnival rides, and all kinds of events to entertain fairgoers. The parade always draws a crowd with fire trucks, horses, tractors, and lots of floats. Many members of the community can be seen riding and walking in the parade. The floats have evidently changed quite a bit over the years. One of the highlights of the fair is the Stout Baby Show. This event has been taking place since 1903, when W.B. Stout Jr. was declared the winner and awarded the $2 prize. The Stouts, who owned a business on Main Street, agreed to sponsor the show, and the family continues to do so today. Even today, some 117 years later, the Baby Show draws the largest crowd at fair time. In 2020, for the first time since 1945, the AC Fair was canceled. The COVID-19 pandemic forced the cancellation of the fair and postponed the celebration of Appleton City's 150th anniversary. Lots of little towns across Missouri in the United States are dying or have already died. They lack the pride and determination that the citizens of Appleton City have shown over the past 150 years. Even as tough times came, the people of this town refused to give up. Each challenge was met with new effort. Just in the past few years, Main Street was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and at the same time, new businesses have come in to replace those lost. That cycle of loss and rebirth is the history of Appleton City, and will be its future, as new generations come after us and work to keep this community thriving and strong. History changes every day. New artifacts, articles, and pictures are discovered that shed new light on our past. To learn more about the history of Appleton City, Visit the museum. We'd be happy to show you around.